I want to share with the audience that, in my view, you will never see franchising the same way again after reading this book. It is absolutely life-changing if you're a franchisor or if you're a franchisee, and I cannot recommend the book enough. I want to come right out of the gate and share that with the audience. The book has stirred a lot of emotion for me as a bootstrapping founder that has gone through the private equity process a few times. But I want to start, Alicia, by asking you, first off, what even inspired you to write Big Money in Franchising?
Because I saw there was a gap in people's understanding. No one's ever written about private equities commanding performance in franchising ever like this. There's some legal papers and there's been some presentations at different IFA conferences and such like that, but no one ever talked about, how did it change the competition? How does it change the face of franchising? How does it change culture? What's the impact to franchisees? It was mostly about, getting a deal done, how to find a partner, very transactional kinds of things. And I thought, from what I'm hearing from founders, this is something that really needs to be better understood. So I figured, I've got a background in this and I can tackle it. And I did.
That's awesome. So what is your background?
So actually, I worked in high tech before I came into franchising. And like many other people, I, came in wanting to make a change in my life and became a multi-unit franchisee in the Sylvan Learning System. And I loved it and decided franchising was going to be it for me. This is the rest of my career I'm going to spend in franchising. When I took over these units, they were in distress. I kind of fixed them up and sold them. And then from there moved into franchise development and then more traditional management consulting, working with brands that were trying to break out. That quickly led me to private equity. And that's when I really got an eyeful of what was going on in the industry. And that's when I really started to deeply study it to understand it better and try to explain to these founders and owners, what is happening in the space and why. As I started to piece it together for myself, I realized that this gap existed in understanding. And that's when I started to really start writing about it.
Wow. Okay, Alicia. So before we get into the sections of the book, I'm curious to know, what were some of your biggest surprises during the research phase of this book? Because it is chock full of data.
Yeah, well, I'm sort of my own worst enemy there because you ask yourself a question and then you follow the thread and the thread, there's more threads behind it. And so the research just kept going and deeper and deeper. I think the two big surprises for me were around, these are professional investors that do this for a living and presumably are good enough at it to make a living out of it. But they make mistakes. And the mistakes seem to me, as somebody who's run a franchise business, as ones that should have been avoided in a lot of cases. Now, there have definitely been, situations where there's been bad luck or bad market timing or things like that. But there have also been mistakes of due diligence. There have been mistakes of execution, and especially mistakes missing the core of franchising, which is franchisees have to make money for this thing to work. They have to be satisfied with what they're getting back out of the money they've put in and the effort they've put in. If you don't have that at the core foundation of what you're doing, you don't have anything. But it's amazing to me how that disconnect has happened, especially early, and sometimes continues to happen with some private capital investors.
Okay. So, all right, with that said, I love your reference to the proverbial frog that is immersed in a pot of water on the stovetop. And that it's almost like the franchise community didn't feel the heat rising. Nobody really noticed. So I'm curious for you to share quickly with us how even private equity came to dominate franchising.
Sure. Well, and let's define what dominate means too. To date, I can count 700 brands that have gotten private equity backing at either the brand level or the franchisor level or franchisee level or both. But if you believe FranData, there's 4,000, 5,000 brands, depending on who you ask. So that means less than 20% of brands have actually gotten PE backing. But those are not coincidentally, the top 400 ranked by Franchise Times. They tend to be the top brands ranked by Entrepreneur. They also tend to be the top brands ranked by Franchise Business Review based on franchisee surveys, which are the most, in my view, the most important. The PE community has sort of cherry picked the biggest and the best brands already. And then there's this very long tail of brands that aren't yet attractive to private equity or aren't taking private equity money. They came in pretty fast in the 1990s after they had exhausted other opportunities. It sort of dawned on them almost at once. There were a few that sort of dabbled in the space. They had backgrounds in retail and malls, and they started taking on some restaurant brands and so on. But the ones that really got everybody's attention were the three big deals that Bain Capital did. They did $5 billion in transactions over about 6 years, Domino's, Dunkin', and Burger King. And they did so phenomenally well financially in those deals, and it was very well covered in the press that it sort of got everybody's attention. And the entire private equity community sort of was like, wow, franchising, what a great idea. This is a great market. And they just started coming in en masse. And over time, each of the firms sort of figured out their level, where they were best able to play effectively. Some, I tried to organize them on a ladder because it's sort of the easiest way to think about it. Mm-hmm. Some are interested in, large deals. Some are emerging brand specialists. Some like turnarounds. A few of them do. And they sort of have all figured out their strategy to win in the franchise sector. And now we've got more than 400 firms have come into franchising and have settled themselves along this ladder, and more continue to come in. That's what's amazing to me. There's so much money sloshing around looking for a home that we will continue to say new firms coming in.
And we're really, just as you said, we're scratching the surface. 700 plus brands that partner with private capital. There was an interesting quote you put in your book that I wanted to share. And that was, it's about the fact that private equity is all around us, as you stated, but oddly enough, they're kind of at this distance from the franchise community. And the quote that I love is from Matthew Haller, the president and CEO of the IFA. He said this: they need to be in the room, not in the lobby at franchise events, cherry picking founders they want to talk about possible partnerships.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, the IFA, there's a lot of pushback on the franchise model. We have to continue to educate. Franchising's not well understood by people who aren't in it. And it's especially dangerous when regulators and legislators don't understand the franchise model. They can make bad laws and bad decisions. And so it's all of our job to continue to educate and share stories. But that takes money and time and effort to get in front of all of those people. More of us need to be telling those stories. And so it's not just enough for the private equity firms to make sure that their portfolio companies are active members of the IFA. But, ideally, we'd like to see more private equity firms themselves participating in some of these things. I think only a dozen private equity firms are actually card-carrying members of the IFA, strangely enough. Mm-hmm. So it would be nice to see more of that activity and not just, as you say, kind of milling around in the lobby outside of the conference hall. And you can always tell them by how they look. They have a distinctive look.
Thank you for tuning into the Emerging Franchise Brands podcast. For additional insights, guest applications, and to stay connected, visit us at efbpodcast.com. The Emerging Franchise Brands podcast is for entertainment purposes only, and the views expressed do not necessarily represent those of Emerging Franchise Brands, its host Frank Fiume, or Emerging Franchise Group, LLC. Any discussed franchise or investment opportunity requires thorough investigation, obtaining proper disclosure documents, and expert consultation before making any investment decisions. The podcast and its host do not offer professional advice or endorsements, and they hold no responsibility for actions, representations, accuracy, or consequential damages related to the podcast content.